The self is always the self, and there is no such thing as realizing it or attaining it. Who is to realize what and how when all that exists is the self? This statement not only challenges the very premise of our spiritual seeking, but also turns our concept of self-realization on its head. Here we find an invitation to question the entirety of our journey, not as a path toward something, but as an unveiling of what we have fundamentally misperceived. This teaching reveals the folly of trying to grasp or realize the self in the conventional sense. It speaks to a profound paradox, that the very act of seeking assumes a separation that does not exist. Instead, the journey is one of recognizing the egoic structures, the myriad thoughts, identities, desires, fears, that veil the direct experience of our true nature. In seeing through these illusions, we find ourselves already within the self, realizing not something new, but the ever-present reality that has always been our essence. The ego is built on the premise of separation, an assumed individuality that defines itself in opposition to the world. It crafts a narrative around what we are, often as a survival mechanism to create meaning and control in a world of shifting experiences. This ego structure latches onto identities, personal histories, societal roles, accomplishments, failures, and thus creates a sense of me that must strive, protect, or attain. When we embark on a spiritual path, it's often this very structure that latches onto the idea of enlightenment or self-realization as something to achieve, something that can complete or fulfill it. The ego subtly repurposes the spiritual quest, becoming a seeker, a person who wants to transcend suffering, understand truth, or attain liberation. It imagines that realization is something it can possess, another identity or accomplishment it can claim. Yet this pursuit is rooted in the same illusion it seeks to transcend, the belief in separation. This teaching disrupts this belief by saying there is no such thing as realizing it. We cut through the illusion that the self is an object that the ego can somehow acquire or become. The self is not something we realize because it is not something we have ever been separate from. The act of seeking itself becomes a barrier, an unconscious assertion that the self is elsewhere, hidden behind the veils of our egoic identities. True realization, then, is not a movement towards something. It is a movement away from illusion. It is the ego recognizing its own falsehood, seeing through its own fabrications. This recognition does not happen by the ego. Rather, it happens within the field of awareness that has always transcended the ego. In other words, realization is the unveiling of the ego's structures from a place of inherent witnessing, the self. When the ego is seen for what it is, a collection of thoughts, emotions, and habitual patterns, its grasp loosens. We begin to observe the very mechanisms by which it operates, the ways it clings, desires, and fears. But crucially, we are observing this from the space of awareness, not as an identity, but as the timeless, witnessing presence in which all phenomena arise. This is the profound shift this teaching is referring to. We are not becoming the self, for we have never been anything but the self. Instead, we are seeing through the structures that have veiled this truth. Realization, then, is a misnomer. It implies a change in status. What truly happens is the dissolution of misidentification, a process by which the egoic veil thins and we recognize that we are not a someone seeking the self. Rather, we are the self, recognizing that it was never lost. The beauty of this teaching is in its simplicity, yet it holds a paradox that the mind struggles to grasp. Who recognizes whom? If the self is all that exists, what is it that sees the ego? In this mystery lies the answer. It is the self itself that recognizes the egoic structure as an illusion. This isn't a subject-object recognition. It is awareness, aware of its own spaciousness, noticing the transient phenomena arising within it. Imagine looking into a mirror and seeing a reflection of yourself, but suddenly realizing that what you are seeing is just an image, not the essence of what you are. In the same way, awareness observes the egoic structure, but without identifying with it. The recognition of the ego's falsity happens within awareness as awareness. In this space, we come to see that all sense of I that arises from thought, desire, or memory is simply a mirage playing out within the field of consciousness. This is why this teaching dismisses the notion of attaining the self. Attainment implies duality, a subject moving toward an object. But in true recognition, there's only awareness observing itself, realizing that the egoic stories it entertained were never substantial. They were clouds passing across the sky, shapes that seemed real in their moment but dissipated when met with the vastness of open awareness. In seeing through the ego, we begin to understand the freedom of non-realization. This freedom is not an experience of something added or gained, but an unfathomable relief, as we release the strain of identifying with the transient self-images we once held so tightly. Non-realization is not an emptiness or a void. It is the fullness of being itself, unrestricted by the need to define or encapsulate itself. When we stop striving for realization, what remains is a profound ease, a surrender to the flow of life without the impulse to control, own, or transform it. We find ourselves moving through life as the self, not as a separate entity navigating a hostile world, but as a boundless awareness expressing itself through each moment. This is liberation in the truest sense, an inner freedom unshackled by the constraints of egoic striving. In this space of non-realization, the notion of attaining anything becomes laughable. What would we attain, and who would attain it? The self is already complete, beyond the dualistic framework of subject and object. Our liberation is in recognizing this, in letting go of the compulsive need to achieve something we already are. This is not a passive realization, but an active, vibrant recognition of our inherent wholeness. Once we see the ego as an illusion, life doesn't necessarily become a blissful parade of spiritual experiences. The ego may still arise with its fears and desires, its attachments and aversions, but we no longer mistake it for who we are. We see it as a conditioned pattern, arising and dissolving within the vastness of awareness. We live from a space of witnessing, from the depth of the self, moving through life with an openness that transcends fear, because there is no longer a me to defend. Living from the self does not mean retreating from the world or renouncing all identities. Instead, it means engaging with the world without attachment, participating fully while rooted in the awareness that all of it, our actions, relationships, successes, and failures, are expressions of the same undivided consciousness. This is the essence of being in the world, but not of it. When we embody this understanding, Even mundane activities become infused with a sense of sacredness, a recognition that everything we do is an expression of the self. We engage with others not as separate egos competing for survival, but as interconnected expressions of the same essence. Compassion flows naturally because we no longer see ourselves as fundamentally distinct from others. Love arises spontaneously because we recognize it as the fabric of our being. This teaching's insight that there is no need to attain the self because it is all that exists is a profound reminder that true realization is not about gaining something new, but about releasing the old. It is a dissolution, a gentle unveiling of the truth that has always been present beneath the layers of egoic conditioning. In seeing through the illusion of the ego, we recognize the self as the unbroken whole, the vast, boundless awareness in which all experiences unfold. In this space, we no longer feel compelled to seek or strive. We rest in the simplicity of being, knowing that every moment, every breath, and every experience is an expression of the same timeless awareness. This is the liberation this teaching speaks of, not a transcendence of life, but a full immersion in its essence, an immersion that reveals the self in every atom, every thought, every sensation. Ultimately, this teaching points to a truth so simple that it is easily overlooked, that we are not becoming the self, for we have never been anything else. In the silent depths of our awareness, the seeking mind finds rest, and in that stillness, the illusion of separation dissolves. What remains is not a person enlightened, but the self, awake to its own presence, radiant and whole, beyond the reach of words. Please like and subscribe to keep getting these videos.